At the center of this pompous assembly stood a lone human woman. She was bound by restraints that pulsed with an unnecessary amount of energy, her arms locked in position, as if she were a being capable of tearing through solid steel with sheer willpower. Her expression was not one of fear, but of weary patience, the kind carried by those who had spent too many hours in pointless meetings. She had long since stopped trying to explain herself. It was clear that the creatures surrounding her did not want understanding. They wanted spectacle. Presiding over the trial was Grand Arbiter Vornak, a being who resembled an oversized mollusk stuffed into an extravagant robe. His eye stalks twitched with self-importance as he slammed his ceremonial staff against the floor, an act that took far longer than necessary due to his species' inherent sluggishness. He turned his bulbous head to the gathered crowd, basking in the moment before he spoke. "The accused stands before the honored Galactic Council," he announced, his voice translated into a dozen different languages at once, each one somehow making him sound even more pompous. This criminal has been charged with crimes most foul against the harmony of the stars." A murmur rippled through the assembled dignitaries, an assortment of tentacled, multilimbed, and gelatinous life forms, each eager for the drama about to unfold. The woman merely exhaled through her nose, unimpressed. "Before we proceed, let it be known that the Council has extended the utmost generosity in affording this creature a fair trial," Vornak continued, as if he had not already made up his mind. "For though humans are known to be impulsive, erratic, and frequently violent, we believe in the principle of justice." The woman rolled her eyes. The chamber gasped as if she had just pulled out a weapon. "There! Did you see that?" a feathery ambassador shrieked, its voice like nails on glass. "Such blatant disrespect for due process. That expression alone is an act of aggression." "I was told this would be a fair hearing," the woman said at last, her voice carrying a sharpness that cut through the self-congratulatory noise of the room. "But judging by the way you're all looking at me, I'm guessing you've already decided my fate." Vornak's eye stalks swiveled to her. "The accused does not dictate the terms of the trial." The woman tilted her head slightly. That wasn't an answer. A murmur ran through the chamber again. It was a small thing, but in a room full of creatures who had never been spoken to so plainly, it carried weight. Vornak, clearly unused to being challenged, flared his mucus-colored nostrils and gestured to the evidence display. "Let us review the list of charges," he declared, as the central holoscreen flickered to life. The first offense. She insulted an esteemed diplomat. A grainy video played, showing her in conversation with a slug-like dignitary who droned on about trade regulations for an exhausting 17 minutes. At one point, she could clearly be seen glancing at the ceiling, rubbing her temples. The footage zoomed in dramatically on her face. "See? There." The human engaged in aggressive eye movement, one council member exclaimed. She stared at them in disbelief. I looked at the ceiling. "That is an extreme diplomatic insult in the xiphoid language," another alien protested, scandalized. The second offense. Failure to adhere to proper bureaucratic conduct. A still image showed her standing at an intergalactic customs booth, arms crossed. The council regarded it with horror. She stood in line incorrectly, an amphibious creature accused. Arms crossed. A direct challenge to authority. The third offense. Unauthorized possession of dangerous materials. A final image appeared. The woman, standing in a dimly lit corridor, holding what appeared to be a coffee cup. She was armed, Vornak said gravely. There was silence. Then the woman sighed, slow and deliberate. "That's coffee." A gasp. The entire room tensed. Human stimulant compounds are classified as potential biohazards under Galactic Code 917b. Vornak informed her smugly. "Your people's addiction to such volatile substances is well documented." The woman gritted her teeth. It was a latte. An aggressive latte. A voice muttered in agreement. She clenched her fists. This was beyond absurd. This wasn't a trial. It was a circus, with alien bureaucrats twisting human behavior into something criminal simply because they could. This was not about justice. It was about control. She exhaled through her nose, then did the one thing no one expected. She smiled. It was not a warm smile. It was not the polite smile of someone hoping to de-escalate a situation. It was sharp, knowing, the smile of someone who had been through worse and knew the people before her weren't nearly as powerful as they thought. Vornak hesitated. His species was not built for expressions, but even he recognized something deeply unsettling in that smile. The accused shows no remorse, he bellowed, regaining his composure. She mocks the sanctity of our laws. The council will tolerate no such disregard for order. The chamber erupted into outraged agreement, voices overlapping in an unintelligible cacophony. The woman remained still. This was inevitable. These creatures had already decided her fate before she stepped foot in this ridiculous courtroom. The verdict is clear, Vornak declared, his eye stalks quivering in righteous fervor. By the authority of the Galactic Council, you are hereby sentenced to public execution. Silence. Then, a slow ripple of applause from the gathered dignitaries. The woman's fate had been sealed by an assembly of creatures who thought paperwork held more power than reason. Her expression didn't change. No begging. No pleading. Only that cold, knowing look. Your people will regret this, she said calmly. Vornak scoffed. You humans always think you are so important. Her gaze never wavered. It's not me you should be worried about. The grand arbiter leaned forward, voice dripping with condescension. And why is that? A small pause. Then, the ghost of a smirk. You killed the wrong woman. There was something in her tone that sent a shiver through the crowd. A whisper of something they had failed to consider. A flicker of doubt. But it was too late. The execution was scheduled at once. It was grand, overblown, a display meant to affirm the council's dominance. Dignitaries from all over the galaxy arrived to witness the moment. The woman was led to the ceremonial hanging platform, her every step measured, her face unreadable. Vornak stood before the gathered assembly, raising his staff high. Let it be known that the council does not tolerate threats to our peace. Cheers. Applause. The rope was placed around her neck. A moment of silence. Then, the lever was pulled. The snap of the rope echoed through the grand chamber. The woman hung still, lifeless. A roar of approval from the gathered officials. Somewhere in the universe, a message had just been sent. But in their self-satisfaction, their smug belief that they had maintained order, the council failed to notice the subtle shift in the air. They did not see the distant storm they had just unleashed. The flames of their downfall had already been lit, and he was coming. The bar reeked of burnt circuits, cheap liquor, and the kind of desperation that clung to the walls like mold. It was one of those places where beings from every corner of the galaxy came to drink away their failures, cut deals they'd regret, or disappear entirely. Agent 77 sat in the darkest booth, silent and still, his fingers wrapped loosely around a glass of something strong and unregulated. He wasn't drinking. He hadn't touched a drop. He only stared at the liquid, watching the way it barely rippled, as if even the drink knew better than to disturb him. The air around him was different tonight. It was heavier, thicker, charged with something that made the other patrons uneasy. Normally, they wouldn't look twice at a human. Most aliens found them amusing, weak, or at worst, unpredictable. But this one? Even the toughest bounty hunters gave his table a wide berth, their instincts whispering that something was wrong, something dangerous. The informant slid into the booth across from him, shifting nervously. A rodent-like creature with too many fingers and not enough spine. It wrung its hands as its beady eyes darted around the bar. I don't usually do this, the informant stammered. But, I figured you'd want to know. Agent 77 said nothing. The informant swallowed hard and pulled a hollow disc from its pocket, setting it on the table with shaking hands. A flick of its clawed fingers activated the projection. The image hovered between them, grainy, blue-tinted security footage of a courtroom, packed with grotesque, self-important aliens. And there, in the center of it all, was her, his wife. The footage skipped forward. The sentence. The rope. The final drop. The sound in the recording cut out, but he didn't need to hear it. The silence told him everything. The informant exhaled slowly. They didn't know who she was. They just did it. Bureaucracy, you know? Paperwork. It was all legal. Agent 77's hand flexed, slow and deliberate, before curling into a fist. The informant swallowed hard. Listen, man, look, no one's untouchable, not even the council, but this is different. You. He never finished. In one fluid motion, Agent 77 reached across the table and snapped the informant's neck, the crack lost in the hum of the bar's neon lights. The body slumped forward. No one reacted. They had seen men get killed over less. He pushed the hollow disc into his pocket and stood. It wasn't anger he felt. Anger was for men who still had something to lose. This was something colder, something cleaner. A simple fact. They had killed his wife. Now he was going to kill them all. The journey to the Galactic Council's core world was not difficult. He had access to ships, to forged credentials, to backchannels carved into the underbelly of 100 different star systems. His face was unremarkable, just another human in the universe, another face in the crowd. That was the first mistake the aliens always made. They thought humans were harmless. It was almost funny. He spent the voyage in silence, methodical in his preparations. The Council's security was thorough, but not infallible. It relied on the assumption that no one would be insane enough to walk straight through the front door, which was precisely why he did. The lobby of the Galactic Council headquarters was a sprawling, polished monstrosity of bureaucratic excess. Statues of self-important legislators loomed over a floor, so clean it gleamed like water. The receptionist, a hovering, gelatinous creature with a dozen blinking eyes, barely glanced up as he approached. "State your business," it droned. Agent 77 slid a forged ID across the counter. "Logistics Department. Scheduled for an audit." The receptionist's eyes flickered across a holographic screen. There was no record of him, of course. But that didn't matter. The being let out an exasperated sigh. "Ah, another one of those," it muttered, waving a pseudopod dismissively. "Go ahead, just don't touch anything important." The doors slid open. He walked through. Security was tight, but security was made for creatures who thought in straight lines, for threats that announced themselves with blasters and battle cries. He was not those things. He was a ghost in a suit, a whisper of a man who could kill with a flick of the wrist and leave no trace behind. He moved through the halls unnoticed, an employee in a sea of employees. The council was vast, its administrative wing a maze of long corridors and pointless rooms filled with bureaucrats arguing over insignificant details. He passed through them like smoke, his eyes scanning, searching. And then he found it. The security control room. Inside, a handful of guards lounged in their chairs, engaged in the universal pastime of incompetent workers everywhere, watching irrelevant videos and complaining about their jobs. He walked in without hesitation. One of the guards looked up, confused. "Hey, who the hell are we?" His gun was out before the sentence was finished. 2 shots. Both silenced. The guards slumped in their chairs, their last expressions of mild annoyance frozen forever. He stepped over the bodies, taking control of the system in seconds. The layout of the building flickered across the screen, every floor, every hallway, every escape route. His hands moved swiftly, disabling cameras, rerouting patrols. Alarms? Offline. Lockdown protocols? Useless. And then, with the flick of a single button, he opened the main doors. Chaos erupted almost instantly. He walked through the halls as the panic spread, a force of nature in a crisp black suit. Guards scrambled, shouting conflicting orders, their training unraveling before it even began. Some tried to confront him. They did not last long. One reached for his weapon, and Agent 77 was already moving, stepping inside the alien's reach, snapping its arm in two with surgical precision before driving a knife into its throat. Another fired a plasma bolt that sizzled past his shoulder. He returned fire without looking, a single bullet through the eye. A third tried to run. He let him. Fear was useful. Fear spread. The council's emergency chamber was at the top of the building, a fortress within a fortress where the highest officials could cower behind layers of security. It took him exactly 8 minutes to reach it. The doors were sealed. That was fine. He had explosives. The charge blew the heavy doors inward, the shockwave rattling the chamber's luxurious interior. A dozen alien dignitaries recoiled, their self-assured arrogance crumbling into terror. Grand Arbiter Vornak stood at the center, his bulbous eyes wide. Wow, what is the meaning of this? Agent 77 stepped through the smoke, his pistol leveled, his expression unreadable. "You killed my wife," he said simply. Vornak blinked. The human. The room was deathly silent. The Arbiter's eyes darted toward the emergency security panel. His hand twitched. A single gunshot shattered the silence. Vornak's arm jerked back, a bullet lodged deep in his shoulder. He let out a wet, gurgling shriek, clutching the wound as dark green fluid oozed between his fingers. "I didn't say you could move," Agent 77 said. Vornak wheezed, his body trembling. Listen, we didn't know. You didn't care." His voice was calm, steady, a blade honed to perfection. "You thought humans were small, a nuisance, a species you could push around." His gun didn't waver. "You thought wrong." Vornak opened his mouth to beg. The gun fired. The Arbiter collapsed. The remaining council members scrambled backward, their tentacles and limbs and appendages tangling over each other in sheer, abject terror. Agent 77 holstered his pistol, and then, from his pocket, he pulled the detonator. Every strategic point in the building, every weak spot he had identified, every explosive he had planted along the way. With a click, the countdown began. He turned and walked away, leaving them with the knowledge that in moments, everything they had built would burn. He did not look back. He never did. The explosion bloomed behind him, swallowing the Galactic Council's emergency chamber in a wave of fire and twisted metal. Shattered glass rained down like dying stars, and the wails of panicked dignitaries echoed through the corridors as the upper levels collapsed inward. Agent 77 didn't flinch. He walked through the smoke and flames, the heat licking at his suit, the distant shrieks of bureaucratic agony barely registering in his ears. He had seen destruction before. He had caused destruction before. But this was different. This wasn't just an operation, a contract, or another faceless mission. This was personal. The Council's guards scrambled like insects, some trying to form a last-minute defensive line, others fleeing like the gutless creatures they were. The ones that stayed fired wildly, their energy weapons scorching the walls and floors with erratic panic shots. But they weren't aiming at him. They were aiming at a myth, at the impossible, at a man who should not have made it this far, who should not have breached the impenetrable walls of their hallowed bureaucracy. They fired at a force of nature. Agent 77 moved with lethal efficiency, weaving through the chaos, his pistol precise, his footfalls measured. The first guard barely registered the silenced round before his body slumped against a marble pillar, blue blood pooling beneath him. The second had time to blink before his brain matter painted the wall behind him. The third dropped his weapon and ran. Smart, but not smart enough. Agent 77's fingers flexed around the grip of a combat knife, and in one fluid motion, he threw it. The blade spun through the air, embedding itself between the fleeing alien's shoulder blades. A strangled gasp, a staggered step, and then he was down, twitching on the floor. The building's internal alarms screamed in protest, a desperate plea for order in a moment that had long since spiraled into anarchy. Automated emergency systems deployed suppression drones, sleek mechanical sentinels designed to neutralize threats without discrimination. They hovered into position, their targeting systems scanning for anything that didn't belong, which, at this moment, was everything. The first drone locked onto him, its energy cannon whirring to life. He pivoted, drawing his second pistol, and fired a single shot straight into its sensor. The drone jerked violently before plummeting, its own weapon misfiring and tearing through a cluster of guards who had been foolishly regrouping behind it. The second drone came from above, dropping from the smoke-choked rafters like a vulture. He twisted out of the way just as it fired, the bolt searing the floor where he had stood a second before. He grabbed a discarded energy rifle from a fallen guard, aimed, and put a concentrated burst straight into its propulsion unit. The drone sparked, sputtered, then spiraled out of control, crashing through a gilded statue of some long-dead bureaucrat. The irony was not lost on him. The corridors were choked with panic. Council members tripped over their elaborate robes. Diplomats screamed into communication devices that no longer functioned, and security teams yelled orders that no one listened to. The Council's last line of defense was deployed in desperation. A squad of elite enforcers, thickly armored and armed with weaponry designed for planetary suppression. They entered the main hall with formation precision, their commander barking orders. Target is a priority-level threat. Engage with maximum. His head exploded. The enforcers hesitated. That was all the time he needed. He moved before their collective brains could process what had just happened. Rolling forward, he grabbed a fallen plasma grenade from the body of a dead security officer and lobbed it into their ranks. The ensuing blast tore through their tight formation, sending armored bodies flying in all directions. Those that remained standing had just enough time to regret it. One clawed at his rifle, trying to aim. 77 was already inside his guard, driving a reinforced boot into the alien's knee joint. There was a sickening crack, followed by a scream that was cut short as his knife slit the creature's throat. Another enforcer charged, relying on brute strength. A mistake. 77 sidestepped, grabbed the alien's outstretched arm, and used its momentum to drive it headfirst into a steel column. Its helmeted skull caved inward with a wet crunch. The remaining enforcers abandoned all pretense of tactics and simply opened fire. But by then, it was far too late. He was already gone, slipping into the shadows, letting them waste their ammunition on nothing but ghosts and smoke. He pressed forward. The Council's offices were in ruins. The once pristine hallways, where laws had been passed that condemned entire species to servitude, were now littered with bodies and wreckage. The great chambers, where arrogant declarations of order had been made, now burned with the flames of their own undoing. He walked through it all, calm, methodical, untouched by the destruction he had wrought. He reached the emergency transport bay. It was filled with high-ranking officials desperately trying to board escape vessels, their fear palpable, their dignity forgotten. They saw him. Terror rippled through them. They scrambled faster, shoving one another, throwing dignity aside in favor of self-preservation. The very beings who had condemned his wife with smug detachment now clawed at each other like rats in a flooding ship. One of them, a bloated amphibious thing in regal robes, stared at him in sheer horror. We were just doing our jobs." Agent 77 raised his gun. "So am I." The shot echoed. Panic overtook the room. Escape shuttles launched in a frenzy, engines overloading as officials overrode safety protocols in their desperation to flee. They thought they were safe. They weren't. He reached into his jacket and pulled out the detonator. The charges had been placed long before he entered the council's halls. Carefully, strategically, in places no one would think to look. He pressed the button. The explosions roared through the building like a vengeful god's laughter. The shuttles that had barely cleared the launch bay erupted mid-flight, their debris scattering across the sky like dying embers. The few that hadn't taken off yet were consumed by fire and collapsing steel. The council's last, desperate hope for survival was snuffed out in an instant. The entire headquarters was coming down. He moved quickly, stepping over the bodies of the damned, past the wreckage of their once untouchable empire. He reached the last functional transport pod, climbed inside, and keyed in a destination far from this place. As he sat, the doors sealing shut, he finally allowed himself a moment. Not of relief, not of satisfaction, just silence. The pod shuddered as it detached from a station. Through the viewing window, he watched as the Galactic Council, the heart of interstellar law, the institution that had thought itself above consequence, collapsed in on itself. Fire consumed the sky. Debris drifted in the void like remnants of a shattered monument. And in that moment, the galaxy changed. They had thought humanity was small. Now, they would never forget what one human had done. And it was only the beginning. The galaxy was still burning. Not in the literal sense. Most of the flames had long since died down, leaving only charred wreckage and crumbling bureaucracy in their wake. But in the hearts and minds of those who had watched the destruction unfold, the fire remained. It was a fire of fear, of uncertainty, of a long-held arrogance finally shattered beneath the weight of its own hubris. The Galactic Council was no more. What had once been the unshakable core of interstellar governance was now nothing more than a smoldering ruin, a ghost of an empire that had thought itself untouchable. Its laws, its treaties, its declarations, all turned to dust in the space of a single night. The universe had watched in stunned silence as the great halls of diplomacy collapsed under the will of a single man. And that silence had not yet broken. Agent 77 stood at the edge of an unnamed asteroid, staring out at the wreckage of what had once been the beating heart of intergalactic order. The remains of the Council's headquarters drifted in the void before him, a graveyard of twisted metal and dead ambition. He had done what he came to do, and yet there was no victory here, no satisfaction, only the cold, hollow truth that she was still gone. The weight of it pressed against him in a way no bullet ever could. He had burned down an empire, crushed the creatures who had stolen her from him, turned their legacy to ash. But in the end, it did not bring her back. The rage that had driven him, the singular purpose that had carried him through fire and blood, was now nothing more than an echo in his bones. And for the first time in a long time, he didn't know what came next. The galaxy did. Rumors spread like wildfire. They whispered his name in every dark corner of the known universe, in the back alleys of crime-ridden planets, in the war rooms of newly forming governments. Some called him a terrorist. Some called him a legend. All agreed on one thing. Humanity was not to be underestimated. For centuries, the so-called advanced species of the galaxy had viewed Earth as little more than an afterthought, a planet filled with impulsive, short-lived creatures whose biggest contributions to the cosmos were their bizarre cultural exports and their stubborn refusal to follow the rules of civilized space. Now, they were terrified. A single human had brought down the most powerful government in existence. What would happen if there were more like him? New factions formed in the power vacuum left behind. Some sought to restore order, others to claim dominance in the chaos. But none of them made a move without first considering the question that lingered in the back of every mind. Where was he now? Agent 77 had disappeared. He was a shadow, a whisper, a ghost that the galaxy desperately hoped would never return. But he was still watching. From a distance, from the places they never thought to look, he observed the world that had reshaped itself in the aftermath of his vengeance. He watched as new leaders rose, as old enemies circled like scavengers, as the universe tried to stitch itself back together without the hands that had once held it in place. They were afraid to rebuild too quickly, afraid of drawing his attention. And so, for the first time in history, the galaxy hesitated. It was a strange kind of peace. He stood at the grave, the cold wind of a desolate moon whipping against his suit. The marker was simple. No name, no titles, just a single bullet resting atop the stone. His tribute, his promise. He had nothing left to say. There were no words for this, no meaning in sound, only silence. But then, just as he turned to leave, something shifted. A presence. He had lived too long in the shadows not to recognize when he was being watched. His muscles tensed, his instincts sharpening in an instant, but he did not reach for his weapon. Not yet. The figure emerged from the darkness, stepping forward with a slow, deliberate grace. A woman. Her face was hidden beneath the hood of a long, flowing coat, the fabric shifting like liquid shadow around her form. But as she stepped into the pale light of the distant stars, he saw it. The unmistakable tilt of her jaw, the familiar shape of her lips, the sharp intensity in her eyes. His heart stopped. It was impossible. It had to be. And yet, she smiled. Not a warm smile. Not a kind smile. A knowing smile. A dangerous smile. He didn't speak. He couldn't. The wind howled around them, the universe holding its breath. She took another step closer. And then, in a voice that was both familiar and not, soft and sharp, gentle and edged with something far more lethal, she finally spoke. "Well," she said, her tone laced with amusement, "you certainly know how to make a mess." His fingers twitched at his sides. 1,000 possibilities flooded his mind. A trick, a trap, a hallucination born from grief and exhaustion. Or something else. Something far worse. He met her gaze, searching, questioning. She only smirked. And then, before he could move, before he could process, before he could do anything at all, she was gone. The wind swallowed her form, the shadows reclaiming her as if she had never been there at all. He stood there for a long time, unmoving, unblinking, and for the first time since the fire, since the blood, since the rage that had driven him through the heart of the galaxy's most powerful empire, Agent 77 felt something unfamiliar coil deep in his chest, something he had not allowed himself to feel in a very, very long time. Uncertainty. The galaxy thought the nightmare was over. They were wrong. It was just beginning.